and welcome to this episode of The Collector's Corner, brought to you by the Washington Arms Collectors. This is a conclusion of Tiger, Tiger, a Sniper in Baker Street, our trilogy, or as the Victorians would have it, a penny dreadful triple-decker. We circle 360 degrees and we come back to our first chapter, where we suggested that the 100-year-old short story, The Adventure of the Empty House, was a literary premonition of an event in our own day. The event was an attempted political assassination in July. The parallels we saw were the use of technology, security lapses, and finally, a sociopathic assassin. Let's take up that last point first and complete our psychological autopsy of Colonel Sebastian Moran. We made a good case for Colonel Moran being an adrenaline junkie. Exhibit number 1 would of course be his pursuing a wounded tiger crawling down a tunnel. We armed him on that occasion with a .577 Howdah pistol. But there was more to the character of Colonel Moran than simply an addiction to extreme sports. And this something more was as chilling as having your pericardium penetrated by an icicle. Colonel Moran had an arctic indifference to human life. Exhibit number 1 is the murder of the Honorable Ronald Adair. In fact, a dissection of the complete motivations of Colonel Moran would require a treatise by Richard Kraft-Ebing. We are not going to plow that furrow today, as the actress might have said to the Archbishop. Instead, we are merely going to say that Colonel Moran had an uncontrollable impulse, a lust really, to convert and transform the Honorable Ronald Adair into a 12.5 stone block of ballistic gelatin. Let me explain. Every shooter, every hunter, practices with the firearm he's going to use for competition or for hunting. Colonel Moran perhaps went the hour's train ride to the Bisley Range and there practiced on paper or iron targets. But his perverse desire was not satisfied by puncturing paper or clanging a running steel target. He wanted something more. He wanted to see what his soft-nosed, lead revolver-type bullet would do to human flesh and bone. He wanted to transform and convert the Honorable Ronald Adair into a 12.5 stone block of punctured ballistic gelatin. It was meant to be a trial run and to see what the bullet would do to the greatest big game of them all, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And that's the reason we have the unusual security lapse by the brilliant Mr. Holmes. Mr. Holmes tells us in The Adventure of the Empty House that he did not expect the attack from the house across the street. Why not? Because the preliminary to his murder, the murder of Ronald Adair, was done with Colonel Moran being in the street and firing from the street up through an open window. He thought his planned murder would be similar, and so he neglected the empty house. And now I've put on my sleuthing cap because we're going to take a look at the technology of Colonel Sebastian Moran. I teased you with the notion that Moran used a drone. I'll add now that the drone had range-finding capability. Ha! Shades of Butler 2024. Before we go to that drone and dissect its exact nature, we have to take a look at the possible firearm that Colonel Moran might have used. You've seen this before. This is a gem air rifle from the 1880s, 1890s, manufactured by Eisenwerk and Birmingham proofed. It fired black powder cartridges, flechettes, or a pellet. It was spring and piston operated. It opened thusly. It cocked like this. It is empty, so I will fire it at the camera. Oh, dear. Just kidding. The gem is sufficient to penetrate a window, a blind, and the head of a wax dummy, but not all three simultaneously. And certainly not at the required 87 feet we measured Baker Street as. For that, you need something like this. This is a replica of the Girardoni air rifle. The Girardoni was a pre-charged pneumatic air rifle. It had a cast iron reservoir at its butt, which you could laboriously fill, and then it was capable of firing approximately 20 shots from this tubular magazine of 45 caliber bullets that were over 200 grains that left the muzzle at over 700 feet per second. Sufficient for big game and certainly sufficient for that window, that blind, and the wax dummy. Now the weapon that Colonel Moran used would have been a hybrid. It would have had the compactness of the gem. It would have had the potency of the Girardoni. Perhaps it was disguised as a walking stick or an umbrella. Now, what about that drone? To answer that question, I must first answer a question which has plagued Sherlockians. Why did an epic-changing intelligence, an Einstein-level mathematical genius, make an unnecessary and risky trip to the Baker Street flat of Mr. Sherlock Holmes? Of course, I'm speaking of Professor James Moriarty. What was achieved by that? He would have already anticipated that Holmes would be unyielding when asked to stand down in his investigation of the international crime family that Moriarty ran. Geniuses can play four-dimensional chess. They operate very well in the multiverse. He was doing something quite different from simply having a useless conversation. So that he might survey, as a drone would, every inch of the Baker Street sitting room. He might note the placement of the furniture. He could calculate precisely the distances, even the thickness of the glass of the window. All that could be reported in detail to his major domo, the assassin, Colonel Sebastian Moran. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Collector's Corner. There's going to be an addendum to this where I actually fire a 45 caliber air rifle and recreate the situation at distance, at night, through a window blind, into a wax dummy. Stay tuned for that. But until then, keep your powder dry, your money ready, and both eyeballs scan for those amazing historical finds or fantastic bargains you might find on the tables of the Washington Arms Collectors or our sister organization, the Oregon Arms Collectors. Thank you.